There exists a body of writings that does not demand belief. It does not threaten punishment. It does not promise reward. It speaks without urgency, as if truth does not require persuasion. This collection was copied carefully, often anonymously, translated quietly, across centuries and cultures, preserved by those who understood that its danger was not in what it denied, but in what it assumed. It did not tell humanity how to behave. It told humanity what it was. This collection is known as the Corpus Hermeticum, and if it had remained central, the structure of Western spirituality would be unrecognizable. The Hermetic texts do not begin with law. They do not begin with sin. They begin with recognition. They do not ask who you worship. They ask what is aware. They do not instruct obedience. They instruct remembrance. This alone ensured their removal from the center. The Corpus Hermeticum emerged in the early centuries of the Common Era, written in Greek but drawing from far older Egyptian cosmological traditions. Its attributed author, Hermes Trismegistus, the thrice great Hermes, was regarded in antiquity not as a mythic poet, but as a primordial teacher, a source of wisdom believed to precede formal philosophy and theology. To early readers, these writings were not speculative. They were practical. They described the structure of reality. They mapped the movement of the soul. They defined the relationship between mind and existence. What makes the Hermetic worldview destabilizing is its starting assumption. It assumes the divine is not distant. It assumes the universe is intelligent. It assumes the human soul is not fallen by nature, but obscured. In Hermetic thought, the central human problem is not moral failure. It is forgetfulness. And forgetfulness is correctable. Reality, according to the texts, does not originate from nothing. It emanates from mind. The universe is not inert matter animated by a distant creator. It is intelligence condensed into form. God is not a ruler outside the cosmos. God is the living intellect within it. And the soul is not separate from this intellect. It is an expression of it. This is not metaphor. It is ontology. Within this framework, the universe is not a test. It is an expression. Matter is not evil. It is slowed intelligence. The body is not a prison. It is an interface. And the soul is not condemned. It is participating. This worldview could not coexist comfortably with authority built on distance between God and man. By the 4th century, theological priorities had hardened. Texts emphasizing mediation, obedience, and hierarchy were preserved. Texts emphasizing direct knowing and inner divinity were reclassified, marginalized, or reframed as philosophical curiosities. The Corpus Hermeticum was labeled pagan not because it denied God, but because it removed the need for intermediaries. Yet it survived. In monastic libraries, in Islamic centers of learning, in private collections. When it resurfaced during the Renaissance, scholars treated it with reverence. Marsilio Ficino translated it. Giordano Bruno absorbed its cosmology. Isaac Newton studied it privately. Because the Hermetic worldview did not separate science from spirit, mind from matter, or God from man, it unified them. The texts open with a vision. Hermes enters a state between waking and sleep. Sensory attention withdraws. The surface mind quiets, and he encounters not an angel or a form, but mind itself. Nous. The divine intellect behind all existence. This mind does not issue commandments. It speaks one directive: understand who you are. This is the axis upon which the entire corpus turns. Self-knowledge as sacred knowledge. To know the self is to know the cosmos. To know the cosmos is to know God, not symbolically. Structurally, that which is below is like that which is above is not poetry. It is a description of how reality organizes itself. The soul mirrors the universe because the universe is mind thinking itself into form. Within this worldview, death is not judgment, it is transition. The soul sheds layers of identification through understanding, not punished, not rewarded, remembered. And this produces a question that could never remain contained. If the soul is divine in origin, and awakening is possible during life, what becomes of authority built on fear and distance? The disappearance of the Corpus Hermeticum was not accidental. It was not the result of ignorance, and it was not a misunderstanding. It was a conflict, not between religions, but between models of salvation. In the early centuries of Christianity, doctrine was not settled. Scripture was fluid. Authority was contested. Meaning was unstable. Multiple interpretations of the soul circulated simultaneously. Some taught obedience. Some taught sacrifice. Some taught remembrance. The Hermetic texts belonged to the third current, and that current could not be centralized. At the heart of the conflict was a single question. Is salvation something granted or something recognized? The Hermetic answer was clear. Salvation is not bestowed from above. It does not arrive through permission. It does not depend on institutional mediation. It occurs when awareness recognizes its source. This made salvation immediate, and immediacy is dangerous to structure. As the early church consolidated power, it faced a practical problem. A belief system must scale, and experiences do not scale well. Hermetic salvation depended on inner verification, on direct knowing, on a transformation that could not be measured, monitored, or standardized. This made it resistant to hierarchy. Canonical salvation, by contrast, became externalized. Grace was mediated. Truth was authorized. Redemption was postponed, not because these ideas were truer, but because they were manageable. This is where doctrine hardened. Texts that emphasized obedience, sin, and redemption through external authority were elevated. Texts that emphasized inner divinity, direct knowing, and present awakening were reclassified. Not attacked directly, just reframed. The Hermetic texts were labeled philosophical rather than revelatory, symbolic rather than instructional, interesting but unsafe. The shift was subtle but total. Salvation moved from knowledge to belief, from recognition to faith, from immediacy to deferral. This change reshaped the psychology of the soul. If salvation is granted later, fear becomes useful. If truth is mediated, authority becomes necessary. If awakening is postponed, obedience becomes currency. Hermetic thought undermined all three. It taught that the soul's problem was ignorance, not guilt. And ignorance cannot be absolved by ritual. It must be dissolved by understanding. This redefinition collapsed an entire framework, because guilt can be managed. Ignorance cannot. A guilty soul seeks forgiveness. An ignorant soul seeks clarity, and clarity dissolves dependency. This is why the conflict was never debated openly. It was resolved structurally. Texts like the Corpus Hermeticum were not burned en masse. They were displaced, moved out of the center, moved out of liturgy, moved out of education, preserved but defanged. This allowed the Church to claim continuity with ancient wisdom, while quietly neutralizing its most destabilizing implications. The Hermetic idea of the divine human was replaced with the idea of the fallen human. The emphasis shifted from remembering origin to repenting nature. This produced a subtle inversion. Instead of asking, "What am I?" the soul was taught to ask, "What must I do to be saved?" Action replaced understanding. Compliance replaced insight. And salvation became something one waits for. The Hermetic path offered no such waiting. It insisted that the soul's ascent begins the moment perception clears. That awakening is not a future event. It is a present capacity. This is why Hermetic ideas survived only in the margins, in mystics, in initiatory traditions, in symbolic sciences like alchemy, never at the center. And yet, the influence never vanished. It seeped into theology quietly. Echoes of remembrance remained embedded in Scripture, often unnoticed. Phrases like "the kingdom is within you" did not originate in a vacuum. They resonated because the soil was already prepared. But resonance is not control, and control was the priority. So the Hermetic current was allowed to exist, but never to lead. This is not a story of conspiracy. It is a story of structure. Large systems require delayed rewards. They require external validation. They require hierarchy. Hermetic awakening offered none of these. It offered immediacy. And immediacy cannot be governed. This is why the Corpus Hermeticum feels unsettling even now. Not because it attacks belief, but because it renders permission unnecessary. And once permission is unnecessary, authority must reinvent itself. This is the tension that runs beneath the entire tradition, not between God and man, but between remembrance and management. And with that conflict exposed, the Hermetic map of the soul can finally be understood without distortion. Because what follows is not theology. It is mechanics. The Hermetic texts describe the soul as emerging, not created. Before form, awareness exists without boundary. It does not observe the universe. It exists as undivided presence. But awareness without contrast cannot know itself. So it moves, not away from the divine, but into experience. This movement is structured. The descent of the soul unfolds through ordered layers of reality, described as planetary spheres. These are not physical locations. They are conditions of consciousness. At each threshold, awareness takes on weight. At the first boundary, awareness encounters time. Duration appears. Sequence forms. Awareness learns before and after, anticipation and loss. Time does not harm the soul, but it limits it. Deeper, awareness encounters order, hierarchy, position, above and below. Comparison emerges. Then force, motion and resistance, conflict as friction between wills. At the center of the descent, awareness encounters identity. A boundary forms. The sense of "I am this." Distinction becomes self-image. Below identity, desire emerges. Attachment forms. Experience becomes something to hold. Then language, interpretation, narrative. Awareness learns to name experience and slowly mistakes description for reality. At the final threshold, awareness enters habit. Patterns repeat. Reactions harden. Identity stabilizes. The soul arrives human, not broken, layered. This is the Hermetic meaning of the fall. Not Suffering arises not as punishment, but as friction between essence and identification. The texts do not attempt to console this friction, they explain it. The cure is not escape, it is recollection. The ascent does not wait for death, it begins with attention. As awareness turns inward, the layers loosen. Habit loosens when reaction is seen. Narrative dissolves when belief is questioned. Attachment weakens when desire is observed. Identity thins when the witness is recognized. Conflict fades when force is no longer fed. Hierarchy collapses when authority is seen as conditional. Time loses terror when awareness recognizes itself as prior to duration. Nothing is destroyed. Everything is returned. What remains is not bliss. It is lucidity. And lucidity cannot be undone. This is why the Hermetic path was never designed for crowds. It offers responsibility, not belonging. The most destabilizing claim in the Corpus Hermeticum is simple. Understanding liberates. Salvation is not a transaction. It is a shift in orientation. Nothing is granted. Nothing is withheld. Bondage dissolves when misidentification ends. In this framework, error is not moral failure. It is mistaking the temporary for the essential. And misidentification cannot be forgiven by decree. It can only be corrected by recognition. This quietly removes the need for permission. The texts introduce no gatekeeper. They describe no ritual that grants access. They describe a process that unfolds when awareness becomes clear enough to see through illusion. Knowledge, in this sense, is not accumulation. It is subtraction. False certainty dissolves. Inherited identity loosens. Fear-based narratives collapse. What remains is alignment. This is why later systems found the Hermetic model dangerous. A soul that does not fear judgment cannot be governed through threat. A soul that does not wait for salvation cannot be managed through delay. Hermes states that the human is a mortal god, and God an immortal human, not equal in power, equal in essence. This does not inflate ego, it dissolves it, because ego survives only in separation. Prayer becomes alignment, not petition. Ritual becomes reminder, not appeasement. Once awareness recognizes itself as prior to thought, salvation has already occurred. Nothing dramatic follows, just certainty. And certainty carries responsibility. The Hermetic journey does not end in escape. After remembrance, the soul returns to life. Consciously, the world remains. Time continues. The body ages. But none of these claim ownership. This is the state of double awareness, fully present in the body, unconfined by it. Life becomes transparent, not empty. Transparent. Ethics no longer arise from fear of consequence. They arise from clarity. The awakened individual does not withdraw. They participate without confusion. Desire arises without command. Emotion moves without identity. Thought appears without authorship. This is not detachment. It is precision. The texts say little about rules, because rules are external substitutes for perception. When perception is clear, conduct follows. Death loses authority not because it disappears, but because it is understood. The Hermetic texts never ask for belief. They assume recognition arrives on its own, when the noise of the mind becomes quiet enough to hear it. They do not threaten punishment for disbelief. They simply describe what happens when awareness remains asleep. In that sense, Nothing in this teaching is imposed. Nothing is demanded. Nothing is enforced. The world continues exactly as it always has. Institutions remain intact. Time continues to move forward. Life carries on with its familiar weight. Only one variable ever changes: whether the soul remembers itself while living or waits to remember later. The Corpus Hermeticum does not present itself as revelation. It does not announce a new truth. It does not claim authority over the listener. It speaks as if what it describes was always present, waiting beneath habit, beneath identity, beneath the surface of thought. And if something in this journey felt familiar rather than learned, if it felt recognized rather than discovered, the texts would say that is not coincidence. It is not awakening to something new. It is the quiet return to what you were before forgetting became normal. The soul does not fear death. It fears forgetting again, which is why remembrance must occur in life. This is the final reason the Corpus Hermeticum could never become canon. It does not create dependence. It does not postpone truth. It does not externalize salvation. It leaves the individual alone with awareness itself. No mediator, no excuse. And if something here felt familiar rather than learned, the texts would say that is not revelation. It is recognition